So nobody likes to feel excluded from group dynamics, but there's a big difference between not feeling like you're included versus having a huge I am excluded core wound that can actually be the source of sabotaging your relationships. If you think this might sound like you, stick around because in this video, I'm going to take you through what core wounds are, where they come from, how to identify whether or not you have an I am excluded core wound through 5 major signs and symptoms that you can recognize. And at the end of this video, we will talk a lot about what to do to let this wound go once and for all so it stops sabotaging your relationships and so that you can continuously thrive in group dynamics. So first and foremost, what core wounds are they essentially ideas we form about ourselves because of painful experiences from the past. So the mind, because it really needs certainty, the subconscious mind especially, will tend to give things meaning. And that way we can store our understanding of them in the name of certainty. For example, if you grow up in a household where you're constantly criticized, the mind will give meaning to that event and go, okay, well, I must not be good enough. And the mind gives meaning or infers things as a means of trying to gain certainty about that event. And so, a lot of the times, especially when we're young children, the mind also personalizes its meaning. We don't necessarily have the bandwidth or the capacity to say, "Oh, my parents are very critical, and that's how they try to function," or "Oh, they're trying to protect me, and that's why they're critical." So instead, the mind will give meaning often about itself. It'll say, "Okay, I must not be good enough," and then we store that meaning. And we try to reproject that meaning back out onto the world as a means of protecting ourselves from having to relive that pain or suffering. So, for example, if you remember you're not good enough in group events, for example, or social sort of dynamics, you may just shy away from trying to engage with them altogether as a means of protecting yourself from having to feel good enough again. So, core wounds are essentially that. Now, we have many different core wounds. There tend to be about 20 or so really common ones for people. And I have lots of other videos on this channel about core wounds of each attachment style. If you ever want to dig in, I'll put those down below. Now, the core wound I am excluded has a lot to do with childhood dynamics of feeling excluded or like an outsider. Now, this can exist because you feel excluded from your family dynamic. That tends to be something more common in larger family settings. If there are a lot of kids in the home or there's a blended family and there tends to feel like there's so much going on, you don't feel seen or heard or included enough. But it's also very common to develop a big I am excluded core wound because you're anxious, preoccupied, and because there's this big fear of being the outsider because relationships mean so much to you and are really deeply linked to survival essentially for you, or because of any kind of experience where you actually were excluded consistently in childhood from any sort of group dynamic, or if you were bullied. So, any of these kinds of contexts can create the I am excluded core wound. And as an anxious attachment style or fearful avoidant, who are the most likely attachment styles to carry this, anxious preoccupied being a big number one and tending to have this a lot more strongly than the fearful avoidant, the I am excluded core wound will often make you feel hurt, sad, sometimes even betrayed, anxious, panicked, frustrated. Like there tends to be a lot of painful emotions associated with this. Now, I want to go through signs that you may have this, and then we'll talk about what you can actually do at the end. But some really clear signs are that you are sensitive to feel. And by the way, let me say one other thing first here. If you have this core wound, is going to like to feel excluded, right? Nobody loves to feel excluded. But if you take a dismissive avoidant attachment style, for example, and they're excluded from a work function or some kind of group dynamic where they work, they're probably going to feel a little put off by it for a moment or two in time and then move on, right? Or a securely attached person, they may go communicate if they want to be included, or they may, bring something up. It may affect them a little bit. They try to deal with it in a healthy, communicative way. And if it doesn't work, they would move on as well, right? So when we're talking about wounds, we're talking about there's not just the unmet need where it can be a little bit painful, but it's a big searing kind of feeling. Like it really stings to be excluded. It really sits with you for a long time. It's hard for you to move on or get over, or maybe you find yourself ruminating about it a lot, right? So those are some of the big differences. And that really brings me to sign number one, which is that it stings more than it should from an objective point of view to be excluded from some kind of work event or group dynamic. Maybe you see two of your friends hanging out from your large friend group And maybe there's 8 or 10 people in your friend group, but even you sort of take it personally that you weren't invited with those 2 friends, and you will tend to really personalize exclusion to a really strong degree. So that's really point number 1, right, of a sign that you may have this exclusion core wound. Number 2, you may feel really sensitive if you're not invited to things when you're dating. So let's say you're dating somebody, and let's say that person's going away for the weekend on a trip with their friends, and it's just their longtime friends they've been friends with for years and years, and none of their friends are inviting their partners. But for you, it still feels like you're being excluded, and you still may feel frustrated, hurt, let down that your partner didn't invite you on this trip, even though nobody else's significant others were brought. You may find yourself still stinging about it. Like it really feels uncomfortable, even though, your conscious mind may say, well, that wasn't the dynamic of the group. It wasn't that we were supposed to bring the significant others. So, consciously it may make sense that you weren't included, but subconsciously it will still deeply affect you. Number 3, you may find yourself being very sensitive and hyper vigilant in group dynamics, kind of walking on eggshells, people pleasing a lot, really worrying about not being liked or being excluded as a result. And you may find that there's this really big pain point there for you when, again, like we talked about, you aren't brought into some sort of function or you aren't included. Number 4, you will find that the emotional charge, if you have a core wound around this, is greater than a 5 out of 10. It's not just like the discomfort of something not working out, but you may find instead it's something that really, really affects you. And you may even find yourself like losing sleep over it, or, having to talk to other people about it, and bringing it back up again, and maybe finding a hard time letting go of the fact that you weren't included or invited to something. And sometimes even like being resentful about it. And number 5, as sort of a worst case scenario symptom, you may even find yourself becoming spiteful to the person who didn't include you. So, for example, you may find that you're short or cold or harsh towards that person later. And rather than communicating about not being included or invited to something in a healthy way, you may instead try to act from spite about it later, gossip about the person, put the person down, things like that. And all of these, if we're just really honestly speaking, are just subconscious strategies to try to relieve your own pain, right? If you felt really pained or hurt by this experience, you may find yourself, trying to alleviate your pain by saying something negative about that person, right? And I think that it's really important for us to notice that if we're doing any of these 5 major things, or even the things we talked about earlier, like ruminating, having a hard time letting it go, really expecting ourselves to be invited to every single thing, it probably means that you have an exclusion core wound. So, what do you do about it? Well, one of the most important things that you can cover is learning to include yourself. And I know this sounds so funny, but when we've got this exclusion core wound, we will often be in a position where we are actually excluding ourselves every time we're in a group dynamic and we don't state our needs. Anytime we're in a group dynamic and we ignore how we feel and what sort of dynamics are in there, we may find ourselves people pleasing. Every time we people please others, we're excluding ourselves from the mix. We're excluding, what about us? Like, how about how this situation makes us feel when we're doing this people pleasing behavior? So, an example of this could be that, somebody asks you in the workplace, hey, can you take on my work tonight and stay late? I have something that I feel like doing instead. And if you just feel the fear of saying no because you fear not being liked or being rejected, and so you say yes just because you're afraid, you excluded yourself from taking yourself into consideration and seeing, can I stay late after work today? Is this a good fit for me? Does it feel like I can, check in with myself and introspect and take myself into consideration to see if this is a fit? And when we don't do that, when we don't check in with ourselves and see what we are actually available for before just blindly agreeing to do things, we are excluding ourselves from the mix. In other words, we're actually leveraging repetition and emotion, which is part of how we program the subconscious mind, against ourselves. And so, of course, we are more likely to keep this exclusion wound alive. So, a huge part of reparenting this actually means being able to take ourselves into consideration. It means being able to dig deep into recognizing how we feel. And maybe we say to somebody, hey, you know what? I can only stay for 15 minutes after work today, or I can't stay at all, or I can't stay today. Tomorrow I might be able to for a little bit. But whatever our answer is in that moment when somebody asks us to do something, instead of blindly agreeing from this people pleasing space, We have to be able to leverage the ability to pause, go inward, and take ourselves into consideration and check in. Can I stay after work today? Does this feel good for me or not? And as we do that, we are including ourselves into how we make decisions. As long as we are not doing that, we are keeping that exclusion wound alive. And it's a really big thing for you to look into. Are you including yourself when you agree to things? Are you including your boundaries, your needs, your emotions, your truth in the relationships close to you, in the group dynamics or community dynamics around you? Are you able to introspect and check in with yourself before you say your yeses? Or are you feeling empowered to assert your no's if needed? And if we're not doing that, that is going to be a huge place of work to really reprogram that exclusion core wound and to see the needle move so you can feel much more comfortable and have a greater ability to thrive in group dynamics. So I hope this makes sense for you today. I hope this sheds some light if this is something you go through or you're experiencing. I'm curious to hear from you. What does your exclusion core wound feel like? What are some of the different dynamics that occurs for you? Is it at work? Is it in your friend group? Is it within family dynamics? And if you are enjoying this channel, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And if you want to do a much deeper dive into reprogramming all core wounds, you can check out our emotional mastery and belief reprogramming course for free using the link in the description box down below for 7 days, which will give you access to that whole course for 7 days to really reprogram not only the exclusion core wound, but any other core wounds you might be experiencing, like abandonment, rejection, not being good enough, things that may really show up to sabotage your relationships at times. So I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I can't wait to see you in future videos.